Carowinds in North and South Carolina is a large amusement park with 14 thrilling roller coasters, and generally they are good, with a few exceptions of course. Nighthawk! Today I will be looking at the worst element on each of these coasters at Carowinds. I will not be including kiddie coasters like Wilderness Run and Woodstock Express, but every other coaster I will be including. Let's start off with the smaller coasters, starting with Kitty Hawk, a Vekoma family inverted coaster. The restraints on this ride are not good, and it makes for a very unpleasant ride experience. There's not necessarily a bad element on this ride, but if I had to pick, I would definitely pick the helix off the lift hill, because it gives a lot of headbanging because of the restraints not being good, and it's just generally not comfortable to enjoy. Moving on to Carolina Gold Rusher and the Aero Mine Train coaster, and I feel like it's unfair to include pre-lifts on this list, as they're not really meant to be that good, but on Carolina Gold Rusher, you just go through straight track and a few turns for at least 30 seconds before the first lift hill, and it's really just pointless, and the only reason it's there is because there's a transfer track to transfer on and off trains. Ricochet is a mock wild mouse coaster, and it gives off pretty good laterals on most turns. However, the turn over the station is pretty drawn out, so it doesn't give as much laterals as other turns, and while it's a good cooldown element in between all those lateral turns and the airtime hills at the end, it's just really an okay element, and is definitely the worst on the ride. Nighthawk is the first of the truly thrilling coasters on this list, and while there are a lot of bad moments on Nighthawk, and yes, I'd like to hate on this ride, I think the double corkscrews are definitely the most janky and uncomfortable moment. I think going through a fly to lie and back in just a few seconds is personally uncomfortable, and Nighthawk does it twice. Also, this point of the ride is pretty rough, and it's definitely not an enjoyable element. Moving on to Flying Cobras, a Vekoma boomerang coaster. While this is a boomerang coaster, I find it to be pretty enjoyable because of the vest restraints, so I wouldn't really say the Cobra Roll or Vertical Loop is bad. For this, I actually want to go to the lift hill, specifically the second lift hill. When you go up the second lift hill, gravity is the only thing pushing you up until a chain locks onto the ride vehicle, and then you feel this really weird jolt while you go up the second lift. This moment shakes the entire train around, it is uncomfortable. Carolina Cyclone is an aero looping coaster built in 1979, and for this the worst element is not the corkscrews, but the turn into them. This turn will shake you around with how the transition is profiled, and if your head doesn't clear the restraint, then you will get headbanging. Vortex has a lot of janky and uncomfortable moments, but by far the worst is the corkscrew. The ride is noticeably shaky and rough in this point, and the uncomfortable bike seating just makes it worse. Hurler is pretty boring throughout the entire ride. There are a few moments that stand out. First is the second turnaround. This is very drawn out and rough. And some other moments include that random double up after the second turnaround, which gives pretty much no airtime, and it's rough in this portion anyways. But the winner for me for the worst element on Hurler is the third turnaround through the structure. Along with doing absolutely nothing force-wise, it's also at a very rough section of the ride which hasn't been retracked. We have now reached the top 4 coasters in the park in my opinion. Let's start off with Intimidator, a B&M hypercoaster. There are a few elements that are a bit lackluster on this ride, including the turnaround, which isn't the best and is pretty drawn out so it does not give off any forces, and it's really just a graceful moment. But the winner for the most boring element is definitely going to go to the helix after the mid-course brake run, right before the final brake run. This is a pointless helix and shouldn't even be there. You go down your mid-course drop and up into an airtime hill before going over this helix, where you also have the picture. The only redeeming quality of it is that when you're in the back row, off the very end of it, you get a little bit of airtime, but that's it. Afterburn is a B&M inverted coaster, and it has 6 intense inversions, and quite a few good elements, including the drop and the final helix. But the most boring and the worst element for me on this ride is the airtime hill over the station. Now it's not bad by any means, and you actually get a bit of floater on it, but compared to the rest of the ride, it's definitely a bit more lackluster. Copperhead Strike is a jack of all trades coaster. However, there is one moment that stands out as not the best, and definitely the worst on the ride. The final turns after the stangle dives in S-turn are pretty boring, plus they give a rattle in the back row. And for a 4-year-old coaster, I would not expect a rattle, but it's pretty noticeable during this section of the ride. Plus there's not much with it other than the camera taking your picture. Now on to the largest coaster in the park, Fury 325, B&M Giga Coaster. Most people would say that the helix is the weakest part of the ride. However, I think that the helix is pretty good all things considered, and you have some amazing head choppers on it. So with that, I will be picking the first airtime hill, the one with the trim. The other two airtime hills at the end of the ride have always given better airtime than this one, mainly because that trim is actually noticeable in every row, and instead of the ejector airtime that the last two hills bring, it gives a small pop of floater instead. Now I get why the trim is there to slow the train down, but if it wasn't there, this airtime hill would be so much better. Anyways, that's gonna do it for this video. This was inspired by Coaster Legend's video on the worst moment on each coaster at Cedar Point. Make sure to go check out his channel down in the description below. Anyways, this is Zero G Coaster signing out. Have a great rest of your day and see you guys.